they are just living in a level of desperation that I never thought I'd see in the United States. Biden that month says, when he's asked about the war in Ukraine, he says, our purpose is regime change in Russia. So again, that has nothing to do with Ukraine. What that means is the Ukraine is a proxy in essentially a struggle between two superpowers, between Russia and the United States. And, we've now committed $113 billion over there. And just to put that in perspective, the total budget of EPA is $12 billion. The total budget of the CDC is $12 billion. We're sending $113 billion over. When Mitch McConnell was asked, how can we do this? When our country, when you're cutting food stamps and cutting Medicare, cutting food stamps to 30 million Americans, cutting Medicare to 15 million Americans, but they're not going to have any health insurance. How can we send 113 billion over there? If we had that 113 billion here, we wouldn't have had to cut one food stamp payment. And he said, well, don't worry, the money's not staying in Ukraine. It's all coming back to military contractors in the United States. Well, so that's interesting, because then you look at, who owns those military contractors, and you see who gets on CNN to pump up the Ukraine war. It's a bunch of former generals and colonels and Pentagon people, but if you go in, and CNN never, and MSNBC never do this, but if you go look at those guys, they're all people who are working for Raytheon and General Dynamics and Boeing and Lockheed. So they're generals, but they're not identified that, they're actually working for the military contractors who are cashing in on the war. And then, those military contractors in turn are owned by three companies. All of them are owned by three companies, by BlackRock, State Street, and Vanguard. And the inflation that from printing the money to fund the war, Biden has always been a reliable, gung-ho, let's go to war guy. And so I don't think, to the extent that he's thought this all through, I think it follows, it's consistent with his historical instincts. And then he's surrounded by people who are, these are the same people who got us in the Iraq war. I have a friend called Keith Amato, who is, and I represented commercial fishermen for almost all my career as an environmental lawyer. And he's one of my closest friends. And he worked hard his whole life, fishing out of Wellfleet and P-Town and Chatham. And his son-in-law now owns a fishing business, but he has no pension, and he's on full disability. He had a lot of injuries and a lot of damage during his life. So he was collecting food stamps, $283 he was getting a month, and it's critical to his survival. Even then, he was telling me, I have to switch recipes to be able to get through the checkout line. I have to buy cheaper recipes and get fillers, etc. And in the last 2 years, the price of food, because to fund these wars that we're funding, they print money, and that means inflation, and that's a tax on the poor. Oh, the price of food has gone up by 38%. The price of basic foodstuffs, chicken, eggs, and milk have gone up 78%. So his food stamps were 78%, less valuable. On March 1st of this year, he got a phone call from a government phone call, robocall. The recorded voice told him that he was getting his food stamps cut to $23 a month, so 90%. 30 million Americans got that phone call. And, that's the same month we ratcheted up our contributions to the Ukraine at 113 billion. And the Fed printed 300 billion unanticipated dollars to pay for the failure of the Silicon Valley Bank. There's lots of money and we began cutting 15 million people from the welfare rolls. Since then, 4 million have been cut. This is on Politico this morning from the Medicare rolls. So there's no money for poor Americans. And the people that I see are living because of the inflation and because of what's happening with this desperation. The average wage in this country is now $5,000 less than the cost of basic goods, of food, transportation, and housing. So half of Americans are making up that gap by putting it on their credit card bills. And this week, we passed $1.1 trillion in credit card debt. That's the first time in history. Most of that, or $330 billion of that, has been in the Biden and Trump administration. Two men who are saying, I'm helping America. There's $1 trillion in credit card debt, and those people are paying 22% interest. If the mafia did that, it would be called loan sharking.
Not dischargeable in bankruptcy, by the way.
Right, and it can't be discharged. I'm meeting people who are, couples who are sitting at their dining room tables and trying to figure out how this math works for them, because they can't. They're having to make choices. People in this country are choosing between food and gasoline and food and medicine. And they're listening to a little baby crying in the room next door, young couples, and have to wonder whether that baby is $50 sick or $100 sick or $500 or $1,500 sick before they bring them to a hospital. And, my wife and I were talking about it the other night, and we were talking about this epidemic of depression and mental illness and anxiety that is afflicting Americans, the deterioration, the sense that the wheels are falling off. And she said, that's the way I felt when she was living in poverty. She said, that's the way I felt when the engine light came on my car, because I knew there was no money to pay it. And you have all these Americans now who are living hand to mouth, and they do not feel that anybody is listening to them in the political process. They feel they've been completely abandoned by the Democratic Party and the Republican Party, and that those parties are now serving elites, and that their voices aren't being heard. They are just living in a level of desperation that I never thought I'd see in the United States.